What I really loved about Bob's orienting comments to us is that, and his example of the toothbrush, and how everybody has a model, but you want to use your own. And, the hope framework, just like thinking about both the hope framework and hope, like the concept that we all colloquially understand to mean something is really a layer. It's about bringing what we know about brain science, what we know about epigenetics, what we know about resilience, what we know about all of these kinds of complementary topics into the work that we do. So into HFA or NFP or peer-to-peer learning or whatever setting that you really see as kind of your sphere of influence. So I really liked that because sometimes we hear these things like this framework versus that framework, and we always want to know, well, which framework do I use? For many years I worked at CDC, and we had our own, essentials for childhood kind of framework or protective factors. And I'd always get the question, well, when do we use those protective factors versus strengthening family protective factors versus, and so sometimes, although all of us are well-meaning and really wanting to like elevate different themes and different topics, sometimes it can be confusing, right? Like when it is like you have to use this model and this manual versus when it really is an approach, when it really is taking everything we know about the field or about complementary fields and really trying to impact our practice and our the way that we interact with families and communities, and other things. So I was happy that Bob made that distinction up front and center, putting on this hat of like we all have a role to play in keeping kids safe and keeping families thriving and keeping communities resilient. And that even goes into our policy level solutions. So it's with all that in mind that I'm happy to have so many of you in this conversation. Now we have about 40 participants. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for some orienting comments that we've prepared. But really, remember, this is your time. I really value each and every one of you taking time out of your busy schedules to be at the first annual Hope Summit, but for being in this conversation in particular. It's wonderful to have you, and we want to hear from all of you. So use the chat throughout. I'm pretty good about monitoring that, but also if people are comfortable, take yourself off mute at any time and ask a question or provide a comment. And I think we've built in enough questions and kind of conversation points that there's going to be time for that as well.
My name is Jennifer Jones, and I'm the new Chief Strategy Officer for Prevent Child Abuse America. And in the past 6 years or so, I've really had the honor and privilege of working with Dr. Sagi and Bethel and Lincolnbach and others on really building the evidence for positive childhood experiences. So I had the opportunity of co-authoring the report called Balancing ACEs with Hope. I worked in Wisconsin in 2015 to put the 6 positive childhood experiences questions in our Wisconsin Behavioral Risk Factor Survey. And I also had the privilege of working with Dr. Bethel and others in co-authoring the JAMA pediatric article that came out in 2019. So have had a lot of extensive experience in this hope work, and super excited to be here with you all today. So during today's session, I'm going to spend some time sharing some things that we're currently working on at Prevent Child Abuse America that relates to hope and early childhood. But we've also really built in, we want to make it more of a discussion and dialogue. So we built in several opportunities to hear from you all directly. So we really want to hear your ideas, your thoughts, your examples on how we can really seize this moment to ensure that hope and positive childhood experiences are part of this critical human development period that we all know as early childhood.
As a child psychologist, as a mom of 2 young kids, I think the early childhood period is one of extreme hope, of hopefulness, of opportunity, of understanding, or not even being able to understand, but just realizing that so much is possible, right, in the future. And so it came up a lot in the morning sessions around, this future orientation of hope. And I think the same is true with children, right? Upon the birth of a child, all we see is possibility. And we can be anxious about that too. And we could be trying to do the best, but it's really, this kind of colloquial idea that anything's possible in the future, and that, we want to set the best foundation for health and well-being. And all of that starts, well, it starts before childhood, it starts prenatally, and really it starts generations before us, right? We come to be with all that was before, and we stand on the shoulders of our relatives and our families and our history and all of that. So it's although it can be somewhat daunting, or we want to, again, have the best available practices and such. Um, did I lose people, or do you still see me? Okay. It's to me a very childhood by definition is all about opportunity. So we want to try to get it right.
Before Lauren shows this video, I just want to say a couple of things here. So early childhood in and of itself is obviously, as you all know, and we all know, a very hopeful period. Children at that age are so curious and engaging and super excited to enjoy and experience the world. And we certainly all hold an incredible amount of hope for their futures. We want to help set the foundation for their health and well-being, and build the context, the healthy context in which they will grow and live. But unfortunately, we also know that there's significant adversity that children can experience in their early years. And since the original Adverse Childhood Experiences study, we know a lot more about brain development, the importance of early childhood experiences, and obviously why we're all here today, both positive and negative childhood experiences. And so we're going to take a moment to show you this brief video from my good friends and colleagues at the Palix Foundation. And it really explains and shows what is the core story, or what's known as the core story, of brain development.
Science tells us that the experiences we have in the first years of our lives actually affect the physical architecture of the developing brain. This means that brains aren't just born, they're also built over time based on our experiences. Just as a house needs a sturdy foundation to support the walls and roof, a brain needs a good base to support all future development. Positive interactions between young children and their caregivers literally build the architecture of the developing brain. Building a sturdy foundation in the earliest years provides a good base for a lifetime of good mental function and better overall health. So just how is a solid brain foundation built and maintained in a developing child? One way is through what brain experts call serve and return interactions. Imagine a tennis match between a caregiver and a child, but instead of hitting a ball back and forth across a net, various forms of communication pass between the two. From eye contact to touch, from singing to simple games like peekaboo. These interactions, repeated throughout a young person's developing years, are the bricks that build a healthy foundation for all future development. But another kind of childhood experience shapes brain development too, and that's stress. Good kinds of stress, like meeting new people or studying for a test, are healthy for development because they prepare kids to cope with future challenges. Another kind of stress, called toxic stress, is bad for brain development. If a child is exposed to serious, ongoing hardships like abuse and neglect, and he has no other caregiver in his life to provide support, the basic structures of his developing brain may be damaged. Without a sturdy foundation to properly support future development, he is at risk for a lifetime of health problems, development issues, even addiction. It's possible to fix some of the damage of toxic stress later on, but it's easier, more effective, and less expensive to build solid brain architecture in the first place. One of the things that sturdy brain architecture supports is the development of basic emotional and social skills, an important group of skills which scientists call executive function and self-regulation can be thought of like air traffic control in the child's mental airspace. Think of a young child's brain as the control tower at a busy airport. All those planes landing and taking off and all of the support systems on the ground simultaneously demand the controller's attention to avoid a crash. It's the same with a young child learning to pay attention, plan ahead and remember, and follow lots of rules. Like all of us, kids have to react to things happening in the world around them, while also dealing with worries, temptations, and obligations on their minds. As these demands for attention pile up, air traffic control helps a child regulate the flow of information, prioritize tasks, and above all, find ways to manage stress and avoid mental collisions along the way. Having this ability is a necessity for positive and level mental health. Developing effective air traffic control, overcoming toxic stress, and building solid brain architecture are things kids can't do on their own. And since strong societies are made up of healthy, contributing individuals, it's up to us as a community to make sure all young people have the kinds of nurturing experiences they need for positive development. To build better futures, we need to build better brains.
I'm not sure if any of you have seen that video or some of the resources at the Alberta Family Wellness Initiative, the Palix Foundation. But that video in particular, I show quite a bit in my presentations. In particular, I think it's a really simple, easy way to understand what we know about what is very complex, which is brain science, both adversity and positive and well-being and resilience and toxic stress.
I think it's just a really wonderful distillation or compilation of what we know about brain science and what we know too about the opportunity, again, of early childhood and the hope, because it's not just those adverse experiences that stay with it and that can impact the brain development, endocrine systems, even the way our genes express themselves, but also the real power of what those positive experiences can do to brain development. The serve and return, I saw that someone talked about, using that concept and families really relating well. And I think, in my own work, when I used to do more clinical work, when families would learn about this concept, it was like amazing to see how like empowering that was to understand that, oh, what I put out as stimuli or whatever, and how I engage with my young child matters, and what could I be doing more or less or whatever, and how all of that is helping the brain form powerful connections and doing that kind of speed highway that Dr. Sagi showed in his opening remarks. I think it's just really super powerful. So if you want that video, you have the link and you can show it. We've heard of physicians using it in waiting areas, while families are waiting to go in for their appointment. They're learning about brain development, right? They're being empowered. They're really understanding, oh my goodness, what opportunity we have for our children, and to set the foundation for health and well-being. So this question, of course, came up already. I think, healthy outcomes through positive experiences framework, the building blocks, that's kind of, what this Hope Summit is really about, operationalizing. But then I think you heard from Reverend Armstrong, like good old fashioned hope. Like when people say I'm hopeful, like what does that mean? And so I'm going to pause here for people to put their ideas in the chat. Again, it's sort of like, yes, we all kind of think we know what we're talking about, and we all kind of think like there's one definition, but you saw he shared several, but there's many, many more. So if you would either put it in the chat, or if you feel like you have like the primo definition, if you want to come up off of mute and share it with the group, that would be wonderful.
And I'll share a few things about what I think about hope, and certainly what some of the science shows as well. And having hope is really to imagine a positive outcome. You all shared that. Even if the present is unpleasant, this thought of a positive future can actually be stress buffering, and it can reduce the impact of negative events or disappointment. So we all talked about, hope is about optimism and what we think about the possibilities for our future selves. And Dr. Chan Hellman at the Hope Research Center at the University of Oklahoma does a lot of research around the science of hope, and talks about how it's having that the science of hope shows that having high levels of hope actually helps improve coping skills. It buffers against stress. It can predict achievement. It enhances positive relationships, and certainly promotes healthy adaptive behaviors and resilience. And so research shows that hope is one of the leading indicators of success in relationships and academics and career and business. Um, and so it's the reason why we're all here, right? So it's so important what we know about what the science tells us around hope, and why it's so important to promote the positive as opposed to always focusing on the negative. And we know that most systems are deficit-based systems; they're not strength-based systems. And we determine the goals. We determine goals for children and families, and then we wonder why there's no follow through with families, because it's actually us that are determining their goals for them. And how can families build hope and be positive when they're actually not responsible or involved in creating what their goals are? And I think we do this all too often in our systems, especially in our deep end child welfare system. So how do we think about moving our systems? How do we help move our systems beyond this deficit-based model, and helping to set and instead helping to build the positive and helping to set the context for hopeful, happy children and families?
But how do we then have the concrete supports that families, that children really need to thrive? How do we have that embedded, and this orientation of moving toward rather than avoiding? I think this is one that our field of early childhood and child abuse prevention in general has really come a long way. We used to be a field that was very much focused on reducing those risk factors, right? And of course, that's still part of the work. We want less adversity, we want less obstacles to achieving health and well-being. But as a field, certainly in the last 15 years, we've really moved toward strengths-based, as you know, the HFA and other kinds of home visitation colleagues that are on this call, and early childhood practitioners and such that are on this call understand. We're really more about how do we promote health and well-being? How do we promote those protective factors? How do we promote hope, healthy outcomes through positive experiences, positive childhood experiences? These are so critical if we are to ever get to a narrative shift, a cultural shift, which I think we're close. The urgency of this moment really helps propel that real forward future orientation, this idea that what we do now stays with children for a lifetime, both positive and negative, right? So not only do we have the opportunity in early childhood to set the foundation and to achieve a vision, like here you see Prevent Child Abuse America's vision, a vision, you know, a world where all children grow up happy, healthy, and prepared to succeed in supportive families and communities. How do we set those seeds of hope, of hopeful outcomes, of hopeful futures now, so that we have to mitigate less of the risk of the negative things that happen early on? So we do this at Prevent Child Abuse America through these kind of comprehensive strategic pillars. So we have a nationwide state chapter network. We have, of course, a lot of HFA colleagues on this call. We have a evidence-based home visitation program called Healthy Families America that's in about 38 states and DC, and a site in Israel. We help about 70,000 families through home visitation each year. And obviously during this global pandemic have provided a lifeline to tens of thousands of families. We also have policy and the socio-political context squarely in our mission. We understand, again, I think Reverend Armstrong read a long quote from me in his opening remarks, but that a child, lives within a family, lives within a community, lives within this socio-political context that we all can impact and instill hope through our policy level solutions, through providing economic supports for families, expanding evidence-based home visitation of all types and models, by implementing hope frameworks in all of these siloed approaches, right? Being trauma informed, all of that, there are policy level solutions too. And then, of course, public engagement and impact. So this is not just about raising awareness, but also raising awareness and commitment to prevention, right? So Those are our policies. You know that it's Child Abuse Prevention Month. That's why we're all wearing our blue this month, of course. And you can see that here our theme is also one of hope, growing a better tomorrow for all children together, because every day we help positive childhood experiences take root.
And then please do support our virtual pinwheel garden. Since 2008, pinwheels for prevention gardens have been sprouting up and growing all over the country, and have the opportunity of raising awareness and financial support for policies and programs, again, that enable children and families and communities to thrive. But until we can be in person again and we can plant pinwheels in person, please do visit our virtual garden. We really appreciate you promoting that, and certainly your support. And then the theme of our natural virtual conference this year is transforming our tomorrow. And so through our conference keynote speaker, as you'll see here, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, California's first Surgeon General, and certainly one of the leading voices for adverse childhood experiences, but for also promoting positive childhood experiences, is going to be speaking at our national conference. It's August 10th through the 12th. Registration's available, so please feel free to check that out, and please do join us in August. So we are also very interested in hearing your thoughts on what makes you hopeful that we can indeed prevent child abuse and neglect and promote positive childhood experiences.
Especially in this context right now of extreme hardship and stress and uncertainty for families, right? Parenting is always challenging, but parenting during a global pandemic, during acute racial and civil unrest. Actually, while Reverend Armstrong was just giving his really inspirational story of his own life and early beginnings, I saw the news come about that, the rapper DMX passed away at age 50. And he has also been someone who's been very vocal about his early childhood trauma and abuse, and then his battles with addiction. So sometimes when you hear all of this, and we're living in this kind of unprecedented time, and unfortunately in this physical distance, many of us are socially and emotionally disconnected from our strong support systems. What makes us actually hopeful that we can prevent child abuse and neglect? I think there's also this shift that's happening now where we're all recognizing that children are actually safer with their families than from their families when their families are supported. And I was pleased to see the new legislation and a lot of that language come out just this morning. So what makes us actually hopeful that we can prevent child abuse and neglect? My answer is that it's really the history of where we've been as a field and what's come before us that really allows us to really be hopeful that we can continue in the vein of prevention, of healing, of resilience, of thriving. So, this is a pretty young field. If we think about child abuse and neglect specifically, many people credit Dr. Henry Kemp, pediatrician in 1962, who wrote the seminal paper, The Battered Child Syndrome. This really allowed doctors in particular, who have such a critical role, leadership role, not just in screening and treating, but in prevention. But it really gave them the idea that, oh gosh, child abuse and neglect was a problem. What are some of the early risks, signs? What should we look for? 1972, this is Donna Stone up here. She is the person who started what's now Prevent Child Abuse America, again, trying to raise visibility to the problem of child abuse and neglect, right? That this was happening even across, families, across communities. And in 1979, the first Surgeon General report that came out that even had violence in the home or violence prevention strategies even listed as a priority area. The first one was in 1979. So only, some 42 years ago or so. So what did we do? This is the first generation. If you think of 20 years as a generation, first generation of this work, what did we do? We went straight to intervention. And of course we did, because we were like, oh my gosh, those poor kids and those poor families, and we need to help, kids be free from violence. So We had these kinds of stark ad campaigns: take time out, don't take it out on your kid. We kind of Healthy Families America and other evidence-based home visitation programs. But in 1992, HFA started in Hawaii, and really evidence-based home visitation, helping provide concrete support to families upon the birth of a child. We know it's such a powerful prevention strategy. At that early time, it was mostly available to families who were high risk. That still tends to be sort of the case with evidence-based home visiting models, right? Versus really seen as such a huge benefit, right? Why don't employers provide HFA or other evidence-based home visitation to their workforce, right? And early childhood home visitation services, childcare supports, these things that we know would increase productivity, retention, productivity, but we don't do it. We kind of reserve it, right? But we could all use that support. And so that started in 1992. And then, of course, the landmark ACEs study that you all know well started in the late 90s. And really, here's where we were like, oh my gosh, wait, things that happen in childhood could be related to adult obesity, could be related to the leading causes of death, like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, stroke, etc. Oh my goodness. We thought that it was, just what happens in childhood stays in childhood. But no, we know that childhood stays with us. It sets the foundation for future health and well-being. So luckily, in the next generation of this work, we went to, let's learn about this. Let's build the evidence.
And so in 2001, CDC received, and this is just 2001, so this is kind of crazy to me, but received its first ever congressional appropriation for child abuse and neglect prevention. In 2006, the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University was founded by Dr. Jack Shonkoff, with really a mission to generate and translate and apply this scientific knowledge to what we know, and really help us close the gap between what we know and what we do to improve the lives of children facing adversity. So this idea of translating science into real world application on the ground. And so the center, along with Frameworks Institute, really coined the terms servant that we hear all the time now: serve and return, and toxic stress. And their work certainly, and the fulcrum, the resilience fulcrum, their work has and continues to make a significant impact on the prevention field. Next slide, please. So we also talk a lot about public health and what is public health, and certainly feel free to add anything in the chat box in terms of what you think about when you hear public health. But it's really about what we do collectively, what we do in partnership to advance the health and well-being of the entire population. It's not just one sector or one profession or one discipline, but it's all of us together improving the conditions in which we all live. And I think we've all really seen public health come to life during COVID and the pandemic, because our individual actions and our ability and desire and to wear a mask or not, or to get vaccinated or not, really has an impact on the entire population. And I think we're really seeing that live out. The CDC Foundation defines public health as the science of protecting and improving the health of our people and communities, by really promoting healthy lifestyles, by researching disease and understanding it, but also this idea around injury prevention. And that's, I think, where a lot of, and violence and injury prevention, and that's certainly where a lot of our work falls. But public health professionals try to prevent problems from happening. And public health really connects all of us together. And so Dr. Sagi presented this in his presentation this morning. But when we talk about this idea of assuring the conditions, this is really what we mean. These adverse community environments that are laid out here in this pair of ACEs tree. So these conditions such as a lack of affordable housing and safe housing, and community violence and systemic discrimination, and people's limited access to social and economic mobility. These all compound one another. And they further add to the stressors of individual ACEs. And so this work by Dr. Ellis and her team really reiterates why we need to take a public health approach. It's really essential and imperative that we address not only these individual ACEs for individual people, but it's also the conditions in which we all live. And so if we are looking at I think I've been thinking about this today throughout the day, but I was thinking, if we're actually going to look at the positive, right? How do we reframe this tree? And how do we describe what the roots are that we need? What do they need to be in order to grow these strong, safe, healthy, happy, and hopeful children and or trees? So something that I've certainly been reflecting on today, and we'll probably talk about more in my presentations, just about how do we sort of think about reframing this to also include the positive. Next slide, please. So want to spend just a minute or two on some of some recent surveys. Each year, the American Psychological Association surveys people across the United States, and they're trying to understand stress, its sources, its intensity, how people are feeling it, how people are responding to it, and then also looking at both mentally and physically how stress is manifesting itself. And so they did this survey, obviously, again in 2020, and it revealed that Americans have been incredibly and profoundly impacted by the pandemic. Probably no surprise to any of us, right? But nearly 8 in 10 say that the pandemic has been and is a significant source of stress in their lives. 1 in 5 say that their mental health is actually worse than it was the previous year. And interestingly, the 2020 survey also shows that Gen Z teens, so those ages 13 to 17, and then Gen Z adults, which are youth ages 18 to 23, are facing these unprecedented levels of uncertainty and incredibly high elevated stress levels, and already, even at ages 13, reporting symptoms of depression.
And I've heard ACEs, that acronym, explain adverse COVID experiences too, right? We all acknowledge how stressful this is. But what I love here is that 70% say they feel hopeful about their future. So hearkening back to that forward thinking, that future orientation, and the idea that that could be positive, right? Why isn't it 100%? Well, I would guess that probably some handful of that 30%, it's that things haven't really always gone well, right? They haven't had the luxury of paid family leave, and let me not say luxury, words matter. That's not a luxury. It's absurd that we don't have paid family leave or paid sick leave as a right in this country when we work, so policies like paid sick leave, if more people had access to that policy solution early in the pandemic, we would have curbed the spread of coronavirus, right? And so it would have been a good child maltreatment prevention policy. It would have also been a good physical health policy, right? So we know that this happens, but the fact that 70% still, amidst all of this stress, feel hopeful, I think that's something that we should lift up. I also think, I think Dr. Sagi presented data from the survey that we're currently partnering with the American Academy of Pediatrics and Tufts to do at PCA, where, even in families that feel totally stressed out in this time, having, 2 kids myself that are trying to navigate virtual learning on Zoom, and we're trying to work full time, and your internet goes in and out and everything's super stressful. There's still also this idea that, gosh, how lucky are we that we're able to spend this time with our children, that we are creating some positive experiences amidst the crazy. It doesn't mean that we're not stressed out, right? That said, I will say that's a very privileged and resourced perspective, right? That I'm able to have, because we have internet, we have computers, we have jobs, we have money to stay in our home, we don't risk eviction, and I have a PhD in child psychology. So maybe I know something about child development. Doesn't mean that I'm not stressed out every day, right? So I do think there's this idea that it's an either or, but we know that it's a both and. So how do we really understand the urgency of this moment and the critical overload on our families, but also lift up the positive experiences that are happening in this time that we know will mitigate some of the, trauma even that's conferred by just being alive in this moment of our shared history. So I think, a lot of the things that you guys were talking about, about what is hope and why can we be hopeful, I think, adding to that is that where we've come as a field has really poised us now to, in this next generation, next 20 or so years of this work, we can really make prevention the effort, right? We can really acknowledge that prevention is possible. It's possible when we recognize that we need to partner. Those partners are not just academic and sector partners, they're partnering with families and with children, with lived expertise and valuing and lifting up that expertise, just as important as any fancy degree that any of us have.
So this past year has been extremely challenging, and has created significant stress and trauma for many of us. Most of us are feeling depressed and anxious and hopeless. But again, as that survey showed, most of us are also feeling hopeful. So how do we build hope? How do we put emphasis on the positive, especially in the early childhood and prevention field? So again, I'm going to ask folks to come off mute, and share their thoughts around how do we build hope. So I just want to say, and I think I feel like we've probably said this a lot throughout today, but it's really, we need this balance between adversity and hope. And we need to continue to push the field, beyond just focusing on ACEs and childhood adversity and trauma and toxic stress. And we must also promote positive childhood experiences and resilience and well-being and the strengths, of our families. So I want to talk a little bit about how we are thinking about cultivating hope in how we frame childhood adversity, and really emphasizing the need for upstream approaches. And so late last year, Prevent Child Abuse in America joined forces with the newly merged Alliance for Strong Families and Communities, which is where I used to work, and the Council on Accreditation and Frameworks Institute, to update the 2004 prevention framing brief that PCAA did back with Doris Duke and Frameworks, again, back in 2004. And so we really felt there was a need to update, because a lot has changed, a lot has happened. And so we really felt the need to update this. So here are the latest frameworks recommendations, to make the case for the policies and strategies that we need to ensure that all children, every child, grows up in a safe, stable, nurturing environment. Our framing really needs to widen the lens, and we need to include the factors that shape those environments. So we've been talking about this earlier as well, that it's about the conditions as well. It's not just about individual adversity. And so to build a broader constituency for those approaches, for these sort of system level approaches, our story that we tell has to spark a sense of collective responsibility. Again, this idea of public health, right? We're all in this together, and offer a sense of realistic hope. So these 6 recommendations made in the brief offer ways to do this. And they actually they Frameworks recommends that we think about childhood adversity and framing it as a public issue, as a preventable problem, and then as a solvable problem. So that's how the recommendations are organized. So to position childhood adversity as a public issue, we really need to tell the story, make the case that we all have a stake and we all have a role in the outcomes that matter. We also want to talk about how the external conditions get under the skin. and how they shape health development and outcomes. And we have the science and the research certainly to show that. And we've all heard about it today from Dr. Sagi and Reverend Armstrong. And then to help people see where prevention efforts can make a difference, we want to talk about and emphasize the dynamism of development. Again, this whole idea around brain development, brain architecture, the building a strong foundation. And then we also want to talk about preventing this overload of stress on families. And then to make it clear that solutions exist and that they're worth pursuing, we should not talk about the impact of adversity without also talking about people's capacity for resilience. The whole theme of today, right? Whenever we talk about adversity, we need to talk about resilience. We need to talk about the positive. And then we also, again, this idea of balancing ACEs with hope. And then we always want to include a proven or promising prevention solution so that people know what we have and what we can do to make this, to make changes and make it happen and make it work.
By way of tools, obviously the CDC, the leading public health agency for our country, has studied at length what the best evidence-based approaches are for preventing all kinds of violence, child abuse and neglect, youth violence, suicide, intimate partner violence. But here's the one from their compilation of the strategies to prevent ACEs. And I present this to say that in the first three buckets are all about policy level solutions, right? Strengthening economic supports for families, strengthening household financial security and family friendly work policies. These are things like earned income tax credit and other kinds of tax credits, child support pass through kinds of laws, paid leave policies. These things that we know, EITC alone in one single year can lift 6-7 million kids out of poverty. So it's not like it's inevitable, like it's always going to happen. No, we have policy solutions. The second bucket, promoting social norms that protect against violence and adversity. This is, again, this narrative shift that we're all here to really achieve, like the language, about investments in early childhood being the infrastructure for health and well-being. I love that. This idea that we all have a role to play. And again, this requires legislative approaches, but it also just requires the social norms. It requires us that have a voice, which we all do, using our voice, sharing our stories, making it more relatable and understandable, the challenges that we all are experiencing and the supports that we all need. No one parents alone without support. And obviously supports can be monetary supports, but also just relationship supports, right? Childcare supports, like elevating that. And then the third bucket you see there, around ensuring a strong start for children. I would say the key policy lever here is enhancing and expanding early childhood home visitation across the 10 leading models, HFA, NFP, PAT, Family Connects. I'm missing a bunch of Hippie, USA. Across all of the 10 leading models, we are only helping, or we're only addressing 3% of the families who could benefit from early childhood home visitation. 3% across all models. So, something that Daryl said this morning around the evidence or the home visitation models for congregations, it was like, oh, I'm not stepping on these toes or these toes. There are so many families that need home visitation services. I mean, there's plenty to go around. We need all of these approaches working together to see what are the needs of that particular family in that particular community, right? So there's really a lot of work to be done here. But again, there are policy level solutions and things that we need to think about. And then you can see the other three buckets of strategies. I won't go into detail there. Obviously, a historic $1.9 trillion pandemic relief plan is now the context, right, that we're operating in, where this is such a significant investment in the conditions, the socio-political conditions that families need.
How do we use this to think about further setting the context for health and well-being for children and families in our country. We believe there's a ton of potential and opportunity here for using these dollars to continue to advance a comprehensive prevention system in our states and across the country. And as you all know, and as you have all probably experienced yourself, during this pandemic, parents and caregivers have been confronted with incredible and extraordinary challenges, including lost wages due to reduced work hours and a lack of childcare and housing instability and managing households and multiple things that come with that when you're working from home, and among so many other things and hardships that can compound the day-to-day stress of raising children. So the recent American Rescue Plan provides a 400% increase, 400% increase in funding for community-based child abuse prevention, or what we call CBCAP. It also provides $150 million in emergency funds for McV, the Maternal, Infant, and Early Childhood Home Visiting Program. There's unemployment benefits in there and rent and utility assistance, and then it expands the child tax credit. So in fact, the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University said that this plan, the American Rescue Plan, could actually cut child poverty by more than half in 2021. So historic and significant and incredibly hopeful and exciting. Next slide, please. So I just want to show you a couple of things here in terms of the CBCAP. So CBCAP, as folks may know, represents the main federal investment in primary prevention programs in our country. However, in 2020, this still only funded prevention at 82 cents per child per year. So it results in a great deal of unmet need. And in fact, we talk about the fact that Healthy Families America Home Visiting and all the other home visiting programs combined, I think there's 10, Jen can correct me if I'm wrong, so combined, all the home visiting programs in this country only reach 3% of the eligible population. So there's a significant amount of unmet need. There's significant amount of children and families that could really use the home visiting programs and other prevention programs that exist out there. And so getting it to folks is crucial and important. Next slide. And so CBCAP received $250 million, again, a 400% increase in one-time emergency funding. And the grant provides, CBCAP provides grants to all 50 states. It's designed to help families get the support they need before harm occurs. So it's all about prevention. So it includes, support for home visiting services and parent support programs and family resource centers and early childhood programs and other key essential services that we know are critical and important. Next slide. So in fiscal year 20, there was a 16 million increase in CBCAP. That was the first increase that we've seen in nearly 15 years. Then the American Rescue Plan comes in and it provides a 400% increase in funding over the fiscal year 21 appropriations. And now we're in the midst of advocating for reauthorization of CAPTA. And we're asking for $750 million for prevention services and supports.
Because we know so many good things that come from these prevention dollars, which again, compared to downstream dollars, is such a small investment. But we know that these dollars can be used for family resource centers, for expanding evidence-based home visitation, for providing concrete supports to families like diapers and data and devices and all these things that we know are so important for mental health and for all kinds of health and well-being for children and families. Also, in terms of this narrative shift, I want you all to know about Thriving Families, Safer Children. And this is really a national commitment to child and family well-being. This is a partnership between Prevent Child Abuse America, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, Casey Family Programs, and the Children's Bureau. So that's where, child welfare for our country in the United States have partnered to say, we need to move away from only having a system of child welfare, of child protection, of removing kids from their homes, and instead provide prevention supports and provide the foundation and the critical services and supports that families need before they find themselves in crisis. So, really, how do we create a child and family well being system in this country? We are currently working with 23 jurisdictions around the country in one of these rounds, either round one or round two, really trying to focus on creating more just and equitable systems. So, race equity is a core feature of this work. Also, a core feature is integrating lived expertise and listening to families in coming up with the solutions. Again, I think so many of you put listen in the chat box, active listening. Don't presume that we know what families need. Let me assure you that when we ask families and when we ask the community and we actually listen, they know, we all know what the great strengths are or assets in our community, and we know what some of the challenges are. So if we could just listen and actually listen with humility and with our whole selves, we will have even more prevention solutions to advocate for at a bigger scale.
So these are just some examples that we're engaged in. I'm sure there are others. I know there are others. But what else should we be doing to build hope into early childhood?
What else is needed to build hope and sustain commitment? I think that this workshop format really allows us to share what you've seen work in your community or that you know about, or what you wish the hope framework or the hope site or any of our partner organizations, what tools do we still need to develop, and what more do we need to do to really build hope and sustain commitment.
What are things you're thinking about? How can we continue, or what do we need to build hope?